Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper Moment 233. The purpose of our Digging Deeper Moments is to take God's Word to God's Word, and we're so glad that you've joined us. Tonight in our study of Isaiah's first scroll, Isaiah chapters 1 through 12, we want to look at several themes that Isaiah repeats because we'll find some of these themes will continue through the rest of his book. Now, the first is that of retributive justice. Retributive justice is the kind of justice revealed in the law of Moses. It's an eye for eye, tooth for tooth kind of justice. Now, this concept is greatly misunderstood today because it doesn't mean that if you knock out my tooth, I can knock out your tooth. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's kind of a standard of justice that limits punishment. It means if I knock your tooth out, you cannot take my house away from me. My punishment has to be consistent with the crime. I have to pay for the tooth and make sure that it's repaired, but it can't go beyond that. That's retributive justice. Now, this is most easily seen in the third message of Isaiah's first scroll, found in chapter 5, where he mentions the cause of the Assyrian invasion. The Assyrian invasions, of which there were three, was God's retributive justice. Israel had violated the covenant, had broken their relationship with God, and the punishment would fit the crime. He says in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8, "Woe to those who join house to house. They add field to field till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the land." What was happening at this time was that the leaders of Israel were devising laws that deprived the people of their land rights, and the leaders were confiscating their land. The entire time, this stealing of their property was declared to be legal, and God calls this injustice. So what God promised is retributive justice when he says many houses would be desolate. They had accumulated houses, now houses would be desolate. So he says in verse 9 of chapter 5, "In my hearing the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones, without inhabitant." Another example is found in relation to King Ahaz. In chapter 7, God sent Isaiah to persuade Ahaz to trust in him instead of the Assyrians. Ahaz, however, chose to trust in the Assyrians. The Bible tells us in 2 Kings that Ahaz, and it also says this in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, it tells us that Ahaz reached out to the Assyrians because there was a conspiracy against him by the northern kingdom of Israel and the Syrians to his north. But instead of trusting God, he looked to the Assyrians. So what do you think God's judgment would be? It's retributive. Ahaz trusted in the Assyrians, so the Assyrians would become God's rod of discipline towards the land. Isaiah 7:10 says, "Moreover, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it in the depth or in the height above." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord." Now, if you read this account, it's found in 2 Kings chapter 16:7, the historical account that is, you'll find that the reason Ahaz refused to ask for a sign was not because he was being religious. It was because he'd already decided to ask the Assyrians for help. So what is his judgment? It's retributive judgment. Because Ahaz trusted in the Assyrians, God would bring the Assyrians down upon him and upon Israel and Judah. Isaiah says in Isaiah 7:18, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will come, and all will rest in the desolate valleys, and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all the thorns, and in all the pastures." A third example of retributive justice is the Assyrians themselves. They were called the rod of God's indignation. They were the paddle, so to speak, in God's hand. And when he was done using them, they in themselves would be judged according to what they did to Israel. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 19 says, "Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is burned up, and the people shall be as fuel for the fire. No man shall share his brother." And that's speaking of what will happen in the land when the Assyrians invade. In chapter 10, verses 5 through 6, he says, Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him against an ungodly nation." But then the tide turns in this message. In the middle of this message, it turns, and now the anger of the Lord begins to turn toward the Assyrians, whom he's going to judge. In Isaiah 10:15, it says, Shall the axe boast itself against he who chops with it? Then in verse 16, the Lord goes on to say, "Therefore the Lord of hosts, will send leanness among his fat ones, and under his glory he will kindle a burning like the burning of a fire. So the light of Israel will be like a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. It will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day." This is speaking of God's judgment now, not on Israel, but on the Assyrians who did that very thing to the Israelites. And this is literally fulfilled in Isaiah chapters 36 through 37, when the Assyrian army was destroyed by a plague. So retributive justice is a theme throughout the first scroll of Isaiah. as well as the book as a whole and in the prophets of the Old Testament as a whole. It really helps to understand this as we're reading through the prophetical books of the Old Testament. Next week, we're going to look at a couple more of Isaiah's favorite themes. But if this lesson's helped you, please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or check out our live podcast on either app or Spotify. And I hope to see you next week.